Greetings, fellow travelers. I'm trying to come up with like a catchphrase for the intro that isn't too cringe, so let me know how that landed. In this video, we're going to look at a concept that has been used a lot in arguments for intelligent design, the concept of information. My thesis here is that the Discovery Institute, which is where most of these arguments for intelligent design originate, is misusing the concept of information when they use it to argue for a designer. Now, if what I just said makes no sense and you're wondering what the Discovery Institute is, don't worry, I will give you all of the background lore before we dive in. What we're going to do then is speedrun a quick overview of what the Discovery Institute and intelligent design are, then we're going to look at the Discovery Institute's usage of the word information and try to come up with a fair definition that's representative of their views. Then we'll look at the conventional scientific definition of the word information, we'll compare it to the Discovery Institute's usage of the word information, and we'll see some examples of how that definition fails to substantiate their arguments for a designer, but more importantly, contributes, in my opinion, to a public misperception of science. So I'm hoping that this video will be fun and interesting, but I'm also really hoping it will be educational. I think it's important to combat scientific misinformation by spreading scientific information, not just poking fun at the people who are spreading scientific misinformation, although that can be kind of fun too. So we'll take some time to really get into the details of what information means scientifically, and trust me, it is a very cool topic. Information in the style of the Discovery Institute. The Discovery Institute, or the DI, is a think tank founded in the early 1990s that advocates for generally conservative positions on cultural and political issues. Their mission statement, I think, is very informative. Mind, not matter, is the source and crown of creation, the wellspring of human achievement. Conceived by the ancient Hebrews, Greeks, and Christians, and elaborated in the American founding, Western culture has encouraged creativity, enabled discovery, and upheld the uniqueness and dignity of human beings. Linking religious, political, and economic liberty, the Judeo-Christian culture has established the rule of law, codified respect for human rights, and conceived constitutional democracy. It has engendered development of science and technology, as well as economic creativity and innovation. In contrast, the contemporary materialistic worldview denies the intrinsic dignity and freedom of human beings and enfeebles scientific creativity and technological innovation. Its vision of a closing circle of human possibilities on a planet of limited horizons summons instead the deadening ideologies of scarcity, conflict, mutual suspicion, and despair. What we're interested in for the purposes of this video is the Center for Science and Culture, which does a lot of the DI's public-facing engagement and commentary on, yes, scientific and cultural issues. The arguments for intelligent design, or ID from now on, are wielded by the folks at the Center for Science and Culture, which include people like Dr. Stephen Meyer, Dr. Casey Luskin, and Dr. Douglas Axe. ID is a hypothesis, and I use that term loosely here, that purports to explain certain features of biological organisms. In broad terms, it argues that the complex, goal-directed, or functional arrangement of the components in living systems is best explained by an intelligence, or an intelligent mind, that designed those systems. If that sounds vague, it's because it is. I would like to provide a more scholarly definition, but I can't seem to find any scholarly articles published in reputable scientific journals that contain a scholarly definition of ID. Let's go to the Discovery Institute's website and click on, here we go, intelligent design. The myth of human-chimp similarity. Peer-reviewed articles supporting intelligent design. Bibliography of peer-reviewed and peer-edited scientific publications supporting the theory of intelligent design. Nice. Okay, never mind. These are just articles that sort of just like generally like criticize some aspect of evolutionary theory. A lot of these are just books that aren't peer-reviewed. Like these are popular books that aren't peer-reviewed. Like, some of these sound like they're arguing for intelligent design, but they're published in the journal run by the Discovery Institute. Yeah, this also just has like argues from like William Lane Craig about just general fine-tuning, like cosmological fine-tuning. Wait, I'm an idiot. It's right here on the peer-reviewed articles page. Intelligent design is a scientific theory that employs the methods commonly used by other historical sciences to conclude that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. ID theorists argue that design can be inferred by studying the informational properties of natural objects to determine if they bear the type of information that in our experience arises from an intelligent cause. The form of information that is produced by intelligent action and thus reliably indicates design is generally called specified complexity, or complex and specified information, CSI. There you go. This general idea is a recurrent theme in the talking points of people like Dr. Meyer and Dr. Luskin.
And both he and these other authors were intrigued with the idea that what we were looking at was inside the cell was evidence of what they called an intelligent cause, because the crucial feature that had not been explained about the origin of life was the origin of the information that was stored in the DNA molecule. The chemical subunits along the spine of the DNA molecule are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like the digital characters in a section of in a machine code. We know that information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, always arises from a mind. Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created.
We talked earlier about the origin of new complex traits. Well, new complex traits, new body plans are always going to require new code, new information in an organism. But where in our experience does new code, new information come from? In all of our experience, new code, new information comes from intelligence, okay?
Inside living cells, there are large, what are called macromolecules, macromolecules that contain digital information, and that information is part of a larger information processing system that involves nanomachinery, and that the cell as a whole can be characterized as something like an automated factory. Explaining how that arose through a few simple chemical reactions becomes very, very much more difficult. It's the problem in both branches of evolutionary theory. Where does the information come from that's needed to build new forms?
We observe that intelligence is the cause of high CSI. We then predict that life will contain high levels of complex and specified information. We then do tests and we uncover astronomical levels of complex and specified information in biological systems, and we conclude that life was designed. And the basic argument is very much a positive argument, where we start by observing that mind is the cause of certain kinds of information. We then go out into nature and we study natural objects, and we see that that same kind of information is found in natural objects. And then we infer that a mind was at work in producing that information.
Center for Science and Culture Senior Fellow Dr. William Dembski writes in his book, The Design Inference. Design inferences engage in a balancing act between the complexity of events and the simplicity of descriptions. To draw a design inference for an event, it must have small probability, or be improbable. In other words, its occurrence must correspond to a high complexity of bits. But in addition, to draw a design inference, the event must precisely match a pattern of short description length, the pattern thus constituting a specification. In other words, the event's description must correspond to a low complexity or simplicity of bits. High probabilistic complexity combined with low descriptive complexity or descriptive simplicity thus becomes the hallmark of design inferences. So with all that in mind, we can take a stab at giving a definition of information as the DI uses it. Information, in the form that is relevant to the hypothesis of ID, is the ordering of parts of a system or sequence in a manner that produces a holistic function or meaning, where a similarly complex function would not be produced by the vast majority of alternative possible orderings of those parts. This form of information is called complex and specified information, or CSI. I think that's a reasonable interpretation, and hey, if the DI really wanted me to get it exactly right. They could just clearly say, here's what we mean by information and here are its properties. Information in the style of the scientific community. Elements of Information Theory by Thomas M. Cover and Joy A. Thomas, first published in 1991, notes that the concept of information is too broad to be captured by a single definition. However, what most formal definitions of information do is start with the closely related concept of entropy, and then derive the concept of information from that. Bayes and Farmer note in the Physics of Information, published in the Philosophy of Information volume of the Handbook of the Philosophy of Science, that this is how Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, actually originally defined information. Shannon first introduced the concept of Shannon entropy. He didn't call it Shannon entropy, but we do because he's awesome. And from there, he defined information in terms of differences in entropy. Similarly, let's start by looking at entropy and work our way up from there. Entropy, although it's been defined in multiple ways historically, is generally a sort of measure of how much you don't know about a system. Being a little more precise, it's like saying how many degrees of freedom does this system have, or how many different possible states could this system be in given what I already know about it. This was first defined by Boltzmann in 1877 for thermodynamic systems like a steam engine or a box of gas, then generalized by J. Willard Gibbs in 1902 in his book Elementary Principles in Statistical Mechanics. Finally, in 1948, Claude Shannon dropped a generational banger titled A Mathematical Theory of Communication, in which he introduced probably the most well-known definition of entropy. It says the entropy of capital X is equal to the negative sum of the probability of X multiplied by the logarithm of the probability of X. Here, X, capital X, is a discrete random variable, meaning it can have multiple possible distinct values. It could be anything you want, basically. It could be days of the week, it could be one of the original 151 Pokemon, it could be a numerical value, of course, like it could be someone's weight in number of pounds or their mass in kilograms, it could be the suit of a card deck, basically any discrete set of possible values. And the lowercase x just represents one of those possible values. So the uppercase x, if we're doing something like days of the week, represents the set of all of the days of the week, all the possible values. And the lowercase x represents one of the specific values that you get. P of x is called the probability mass function of x, which just means what is the probability of getting that value, that outcome. So if I flip a coin, for example, two possible outcomes, heads and tails. If it's a fair coin, is well made, it's 50% chance for either heads or tails. So P of x is going to be 50% if x is heads, it's going to be 50% if x is tails. However, you could have, say, like a biased coin where it's 55% heads and 45% tails. So there are three important conceptual takeaways for this. One is that the entropy is determined by adding together contributions from all the different possible values of x. Second, that the more possible states there are, the higher the entropy will be in general. And third, the more evenly distributed the probability is among all of the possible outcomes, the higher the entropy will be. So the entropy is maximized when the outcome for each possible state is equal. So if we're talking about like days of the week, the entropy is maximized if the probability for each of the 7 outcomes is 1/7. The math we'll look at for the rest of this section is shown in Elements of Information Theory. So imagine now that we have two random variables, capital X and capital Y, and we suspect that they might be correlated. So we want to know the entropy of one variable y conditional on the state of the other variable x. So we can express this by saying the entropy of capital Y conditional on capital X is equal to the sum of the probability of x multiplied by the entropy of capital Y conditional on capital X having the value x. And we can rewrite this like such. The entropy of capital Y given capital X is equal to the negative sum of the probability of X multiplied by the sum of the probability of Y given X multiplied by the logarithm of the probability of Y given X. A way that might help to make this more understandable is think about it like a sum of entropies. So we have the probability distribution of Y, right? We have the probability distribution over all the different possible values that Y can take. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we have this probability distribution for all the different values of Y, and then we are summing over each of the values of X, each possible value of X. And as you go through each of the values of X, if these variables are correlated, the distribution of Y will change as you change the value of X. An example of this would be something like humidity and precipitation. Depending on the humidity, your expectation of what the precipitation might be is going to change. If the humidity is super low, you'll probably have like a probability distribution for precipitation that's going to skew more towards less precipitation. If the humidity is very high, you're going to say, okay, well now I have like a higher chance of like higher values of precipitation for that day. Okay, so we've got the entropy and we've got the conditional entropy. We need one more before we get to information. The relative entropy, also referred to as the Kullback-Leibler distance or the KL divergence of a discrete random variable p with probability mass function p of x relative to a discrete random variable q with probability mass function q of x, is expressed as d of p relative to q is equal to the sum of p of x times the logarithm of p of x over q of x. This is broadly a way of measuring the similarity of two distributions. You can get an idea of this just by considering the case where the two probability distributions are the same. So in that case, the ratio in the logarithm there will just be 1, meaning the value of the logarithm will be 0. So everything gets multiplied by 0, and the relative entropy is 0. And that makes sense, they're the same, there's no difference. So roughly, the more different the two distributions are, the larger the relative entropy will be. Now, using logarithmic identities, we could rewrite this as the sum of the probability of x times the logarithm of p of x over q of x is equal to the sum of p of x multiplied by the logarithm of p of x minus the logarithm of q of x. You'll notice this looks a lot like the difference in entropy between the two distributions, but with a little bit of asymmetry. Like, notice that if we flipped these symbols, like if we said q relative to p instead of p relative to q, you wouldn't necessarily get the same answer. So the relative entropy of p to q is not necessarily the same as the relative entropy of q to p. Finally, we can introduce the idea of information. First, just consider what we've looked at and what we've learned so far. First, for any system or variable we can define that can be in different states, there is an entropy of that system. And the entropy represents how much uncertainty we have about what state that system or variable is in. Then we have conditional entropy. So we can bring in a second variable, and we can say, okay, given what I know about this second variable, now how much entropy does that first variable have? Finally, we can look at relative entropy, which is basically a way of saying, okay, how similar are these two distributions, or how similar is my knowledge of these two systems? Okay, so information. Information is a measure of how much you do know about a system. And this is quantified, yes, in terms of entropy. It looks at the difference between the maximum possible entropy the system could have and how much entropy the system actually does have. And this is represented mathematically as the mutual information between two systems. The mutual information of x and y is equal to the entropy of x minus the entropy of x conditional on y. And this is equal to the relative entropy, or KL divergence, of the joint probability of x and y relative to the individual probabilities of x and why. So remember we saw that the maximum entropy of a system happens when every outcome is equally likely. So imagine we're looking at like the 4 seasons. If I ask you what my favorite season is, initially you would probably have a 1 in 4 chance for each of the possible outcomes for the 4 seasons. But if I told you that I liked going to the beach or something, or I liked getting a tan, I don't, then that's going to nudge your probability of like summer like a little higher, and so like winter a little lower. And in that case, you would have gotten some information because your probability distribution is getting more focused on a narrower range of possibilities. You know a little bit better what my favorite season might be. That is information. The more you decrease the entropy, the more information you have. Oh, and conversely, of course, this means that the maximum amount of information you can have corresponds with the minimum amount of entropy. So maximum information would just be like if I said, it's winter, my favorite season's actually winter. And then you know the possibility of winter is 100%. The possibility of all the other outcomes is 0%. That is 0 entropy and maximum information. So this makes sense with our definition of information expressed as conditional entropy. It takes the maximum possible entropy of the system, and then it looks at the entropy of that system conditional on y. And the lower the entropy is conditional on y, the more of a difference there will be between those two things. The more the knowledge of y is lowering the entropy of x, so the more information you have. And you'll notice from the relative entropy expression of the information that this is actually symmetric. It doesn't matter if you put x or y first when you're looking at the mutual information. You can flip them around and it's the same. The information that x has about y is the same as the information that y has about x. Now you might be wondering why we started by talking about the mutual information instead of just information in general. And the reason for that is that, this is important, drumroll please, all information is mutual information. There is no such thing as information not relative to anything else. A good analogy would be something like velocity. We now know, thanks to special relativity, that velocity is a relative concept. There's no such thing as the velocity of an object, just by itself in a vacuum. There is only the velocity of an object relative to some other object or reference that we've defined. So a couple times now, for examples, I've used kind of this intuitive idea of like, how much do I know about the system? Really, what we are talking about in all cases with information is we are just talking about 2 systems that are correlated with each other. Me knowing something about a system is just a nice kind of intuitive way to think about it. But the fundamental idea, remember, is just this idea of mutual correlation between 2 systems. Taking the Discovery Institute's information seriously. So with that basic overview of information under our belt, we can now take the DI's definition of information and the scientific, let's call it the mathematical definition of information, and really make them face off against each other. So DI information versus mathematical information, 1v1, Fox only, final destination, no items. I want to be fair to the DI here, so I'll take them seriously in the definition they've provided, and I'll try and take a good faith interpretation of statements that they make if they're unclear. But I will be serious. ID claims to be a scientific theory, so we're going to judge it by the same standards of rigor that are applied to things like the mathematical formulation of information. There are a couple different claims that the DI makes about information when arguing for an intelligent designer. Let's examine each of these claims with reference to both definitions of information that we have and see how it goes. Claim 1. Science can't explain the origin of new information. Dr. William Dembski is a mathematician who works for the DI. Here he is in a video podcast appearance put out by the Center for Science and Culture's YouTube channel, where he's being interviewed by another DI guy, Andrew McDermott. And here he argues that science can't explain the origin of the information found in a biochemical replicator. So, talking about something like a cell.
One way to look at it is as you can't get something for nothing. And the idea with conservation of information is often we want to increase our probabilities of something. So let's say you're doing an Easter egg hunt, okay? And you've got this huge field, and there's one Easter egg there. The field is so large, the egg is so small, so well hidden, very improbable that you're going to find that. One way you could increase your probabilities, if somebody who knows where the egg is has you've got a little earpiece, and the person says, turn right, turn left, straight 10 paces, now turn left, giving these instructions, and then suddenly you find yourself at the egg. Because of those instructions, your probability of finding that egg has gone way up. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, where did those instructions come from? Let's say right, left, straight, right, left gets you there. Well, but I could have said right, straight, left, left. I could have made any number of possible combinations of such instructions. So how did you pick one that got me there? You raised your probability, but what allowed you to raise your probability is that you had to now engage in still another improbable action. Okay, the original search is just finding the egg. Now you're looking for an instruction set that will get you there. But finding the right instruction set is no easier than finding the original egg. And this is where the Darwinists, I think they live in a la-la land because they don't appreciate this point. And I've seen this, I've witnessed this in real time.
So what Dr. Dembski's describing here, what he calls the principle of the conservation of information, just sounds to me like unitarity. I'm not sure what the difference is between those. Either way, Dr. Dembski is describing this hypothetical situation in which there's this Easter egg hunt, and it would be very improbable for him to find the Easter egg, but then somebody can give him instructions, and that makes his uncertainty about where the Easter egg is get reduced massively. But it's because somebody else gave him the instructions, and those instructions also have a bunch of order contained in them. So because the instructions themselves are also very improbable, because they're very ordered and most sequences of instructions wouldn't lead you to the egg, well then we need an explanation for the origin of the instructions as well. But aha, Dr. Dembski argues, now we're going to get stuck in an infinite regress, because whatever I invoke to explain the improbable instructions will itself also be very improbable. So how do we ever get started? Where does the first information originally come from? Now, although the word being used in this podcast is information, I'm, again, going to be charitable and assume that what he's talking about is complex specified information, or CSI. I'm assuming he's not talking about a normal sequence of random numbers. So remember, complex and specified information is basically information that is both unlikely in terms of there are a lot of possible ways you could order things to get some sequence or structure, and there's this particular one that does some very specific function, or has some specific meaning.
Oh my God, Brian, there's a message in my alphabet. It says, ooh.
Peter, those are Cheerios.
So under this definition of information, yeah, I don't really see how you would solve this problem, because you've just got this order, this information in my knowledge of the Easter egg's location, and then in turn in the instructions that gave me the knowledge of the Easter egg's location, and then in whatever gave that person the instructions, etc., etc. I don't see how to solve it in terms of the concepts that we already have, which is always preferable in science if you can do it. You want to try to be able to understand things by deriving an understanding from the concepts that you're starting with. You only want to add additional concepts or postulate additional things if you can't derive it from your existing principles. Now, what if we ask this same question with mathematical information? What properties does mathematical information have that CSI does not have? So remember, mathematical information is the difference between the maximum entropy of X and the entropy of X given Y. So let's say that X is the path I take when looking for the egg, and Y is the sequence of instructions. So remember, the cool thing we learned about information that is absent from the DI's definition of information is relative. When I say I have information, I mean I have information about where the egg is. The location of the egg has information relative to my search path for the egg. These things are all correlated. The information is only defined as a correlation between these different things. So how does this address the argument that Dr. Dembski's making? Well, by getting rid of this idea that information is just something I have that needs to be given to me by something. It's not something that I have. It's something that I only have relative to some other system. The fact that I have information about a system is not a property of me. It's a property of both systems. You can define how much information you do or don't have simply by picking different systems. Now, Dr. Dembski could say that's sort of dodging the question. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's relative, whatever, you still need to explain it. Why are there two systems that have this mutual property? And to that, I would respond with an example. Imagine you have, say, like a big rock, right? That, like, I don't know, like wind blows it off a cliff. It falls down, it hits the ground below, and it splits into two pieces. You've got this sort of jagged, messy line down the middle that splits it. So you've got these two pieces now, and each of them has this very specific, jagged, messy pattern. And both of those patterns on each side match perfectly. They are highly correlated. They have a lot of information about each other. And the reason they have a lot of information about each other is because they started from the same place. They came from the same thing. They're not just two things that were randomly generated and then put in a room together. They had a common origin, and the common origin that they had means that the event which led to this new situation where you've got two jagged parts that are highly correlated, that event happened to both of them. They both experienced the same thing, the splitting. So now they're correlated, because that correlation reflects a shared history that they have. In the Easter egg hunt situation, it's the same. The reason that I know where to find the egg is because the other dude gave me the instructions. But the reason that dude has instructions that are correct is because he and the location of the egg share some common history. At some point, he probably saw the dude hiding the egg. Or he looked around beforehand, and he tried a bunch of different sequences, and then found the egg and picked out the sequence of instructions that is correlated with the location of the egg. There's a common history. These two things converge at some point in the past, and that is what gives them their correlation. Claim 2. Information only comes from a mind. This is Dr. Stephen Meyer, a senior fellow at the DI with a PhD in the philosophy of science, speaking in the context of a discussion about DNA and biochemistry.
Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind. Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that it's machine code. Well, when we see a software program, we always know that it came from a programmer. In fact, whenever we see information, whether it's in software or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal, you trace it back to its ultimate source. You always come to a mind, not a material process.
Again, we're going to be generous here and assume that he's talking about CSI, because if he were actually just talking about information, like he says, then this claim would be contradicted by literally like anything. I mean, because again, information is just correlation between two systems. So if I can look at a rock outside and I get information. Because I get information, for example, that the environment in the immediate vicinity of the rock isn't hot enough to melt rock. So CSI only comes from a mind. Dr. Meyer gives us some examples of CSI: software, a paragraph in a book, a hieroglyphic inscription, radio signal. Dr. Meyer argues that since, we have all these examples of CSI and they're all produced by an intelligence, well, we can look at something like the DNA code, which is similarly functional. It does something useful, meaningful, interesting, that's very, very unlikely. You can arrange letters of the DNA sequence in many different ways, and most of them aren't going to do anything useful. Then Dr. Meyer argues we'd be justified in inferring, since everything else with these properties of CSI came from an intelligence, then DNA probably also came from an intelligence. So, under the CSI definition of information, yeah, these things are all the same kind of thing generally. So maybe we would be justified in thinking, well, maybe it's a little more likely that this other thing came from an intelligence. Now consider the mathematical definition of information. So remember, the mathematical definition of information is relative, and it doesn't say anything about purpose or function or meaning or anything like that. So we have to try to derive an explanation of this situation using just the basic tools of our mathematical definition. So first, we should ask, what is the information in all of these examples that Dr. Meyer gave us about? Like, what is the information relative to? Given some system X, what other system Y can we make predictions about? So Meyer's first example is a piece of software. So we can think of this as a random variable X that represents, say, a sequence of CPU instructions. What does that give us information about? What does that specific sequence tell us? Like, it tells us what the computer is going to do when those instructions are loaded into memory and executed. So if we just look at a short program of, say, 500 possible instructions, and we assume the CPU is capable of 64 possible opcodes, then the number of length 500 programs is about 10 to the power of 903. That is a lot of possibilities. So imagine I have two sequences of instructions. One is random, just 500 random instructions. The other one is a program that writes "Hello World" to the terminal. Now, if we imagine running each of these programs and ask, well, what can I say about what will happen with each of them? Then for the random one, what can I say? I can say, well, it'll probably crash or something. It'll like give me some sort of like compiler error or execution error or whatever. And that's not very much information because, of course, most sequences would give you a compiler or an execution error. So the random sequence isn't really correlated very strongly with any very high information facts about what the computer will do. But the specific sequence that prints "Hello World," that gives me information that the computer is going to do this very specific thing. And that very specific thing it will do is something it only would do with a very, very, very small fraction of possible programs. So what about hieroglyphics? What's that correlated with? Well, that's a sort of alphabet that's written for humans. It has information about people who understand hieroglyphics. Now, of course, a lot of people, even if they don't understand hieroglyphics, they'll still realize, oh, it's like a language, it's written. So it's got a little bit of information about those people. Like, if somebody like that, who doesn't know hieroglyphics, sees a hieroglyphic inscription, you can kind of predict some things, like they might look at it and scratch their heads or something. But if you have somebody who knows hieroglyphics, then you could write out, say, I don't know, turn around 3 times and then do 10 jumping jacks or something. In hieroglyphics, or whatever you can write in hieroglyphics. I don't know if there's a word for jumping jacks in hieroglyphics. That gives you very, very specific information about how people will act with a reasonably high level of confidence. I mean, you can say like, okay, now there's like a 50% chance, or even like a 25% chance this person's actually going to like spin around 3 times when they read it. Incredibly unlikely if it's not something that they understand. If it were just like a bunch of random scribbles, nobody's going to spin around 3 times. So this has information about, like, humans in general, maybe a little bit, but specifically it has information about humans who understand hieroglyphics quite a lot. Or it also has information about, say, like a similar system that has similar capabilities, like if you made a robot with image recognition software or something like that. Paragraph in a book. Basically the same thing. It has information about people who can read and who can read that language, like English or whatever. If I write a paragraph in a book in English, it's going to have a lot of information about people who understand English. Radio signal, same thing. It has information about people who understand whatever audio the signal's carrying, or if it is a particular, it's like Morse code or something like that. It has information about people, or maybe some machines created by people, which understand or can respond in some complex and useful way to the specific types of sequences that you're sending with the radio signal. Now, what does DNA have information about? What system is DNA correlated with? See, now this is interesting. DNA isn't correlated with, like, people. DNA is correlated with the laws of chemistry. It has information about other molecules. If I have a specific sequence of DNA, I can make very specific predictions about what kinds of chemical behavior, what kinds of chemical interactions that will produce. For specific other compatible molecules, I can make specific predictions about incredibly complex behavior that those molecules interacting will produce. Doesn't matter if there are people around watching it. Nobody needs to understand it. Nobody needs to read it. Nobody needs to give it letter names. It just behaves like that because of the laws of nature. I really want to emphasize this point. When we consider what our system is correlated with, suddenly this distinction arises. We notice this difference that we don't get if we just look at CSI and we just think of things in terms of being functional or meaningful. Sure, by the definition of, like, functional, or like does something, or is useful, these are all the same thing. A paragraph, like, means something, and DNA means something. But they don't mean something in the same way.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
The examples that Dr. Meyer gave mean something, in the sense that, like, people find meaning in it. Their interactions, their correlations, the information they have, is dependent on very, very complex systems, humans, forming conceptual representations of things in their heads, and then behaving or acting or whatever, like, based on those conceptual representations. DNA means something to the laws of chemistry. Now, we can still debate how best to formally describe or quantify this difference, but it is a significant difference. Information as a correlation between a sequence and an extremely complex system like a human is very different from information as a correlation between a sequence and the laws of nature. One of them requires an a priori extremely improbable structure to already exist, namely a human being, and the other one does not. DNA and a paragraph in a book are not the same kind of thing, and we are not justified in extrapolating from one to the other. How science studies the origin of biological information. One of the best ways to understand the differences between the approach of an organization like the DI and the approach of the scientific community is to actually look at an example of how the scientific community approaches this type of question. So finally, we'll look at a legitimate scientific paper which actually uses the mathematical definition of information to investigate the origin of life. The paper we'll look at is called From Entropy to Information: Biased Typewriters and the Origin of Life. This article appeared in a book called From Matter to Life: Information and Causality, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017 and edited by Sarah Imari Walker, Paul Davies, and George Ellis. The article is authored by Christoph Adami and Thomas Labar. Adami is a professor of microbiology and molecular genetics, as well as physics and astronomy, at Michigan State University. Thomas Labar is a computational biologist who I believe was a postdoc or graduate student at the time. I'll link the book and the article in the description. The paper takes an information theoretic approach to the origin of life. It suggests that life may be a feature of any chemistry that's capable of encoding information, and thus we can learn useful things about it by studying the general properties or conditions under which information may arise. According to the authors, if the one invariant in life is information about how to replicate, that is, it then becomes imperative to understand the general principles by which information could arise by chance. The authors note that the human genome appears to contain about 500 million bits of information, assuming that about 8% of the human genome is functional. And this is assumed because only about 8% of the human genome is subject to purifying selection, according to Rands et al. 2014. However, modern humans, of course, are very, very far removed from the original replicators, whatever those were, and so our genome contains a lot of information that is much more complex and nuanced about how to survive in our environment, rather than the most basic forms of replicating information you could get. As the authors say, almost all of the information contained in our genome and any other organisms owes its existence to the evolutionary process. But the algorithm that is evolution cannot be at work in the absence of replication, and therefore cannot explain the origin of life. In order to estimate the likelihood of spontaneous emergence of a self-replicator, it is necessary to estimate the minimal information necessary to replicate, because the length of the sequence is not a good indicator of fitness. So the authors make a distinction between the length of a sequence and the information content of a sequence. To do this, they introduce a couple familiar equations: the Shannon entropy of a discrete random variable, and the mutual information of two random variables. Imagine for a moment that our informational sequence is a sequence of English characters. Imagine that I told you you have to guess the US state that I'm thinking of, and I'm thinking of Minnesota, but I haven't told you. In that case, the particular sequence of characters spelling Minnesota has information about the state that I'm thinking of. So we can represent the state I'm thinking of, that concept, as a discrete random variable x, and to your perspective, all 50 possible guesses are equally likely right now. And we can represent, as a discrete random variable y, the sequence of English letters that spells out Minnesota. If I give you the sequence of letters spelling out Minnesota, we can quantify that information content as I sub y is equal to the entropy of x minus the entropy of x given y, specifically the one sequence of letters y that spells Minnesota. Now, the entropy of x is just the Shannon entropy of 50 equally likely possibilities. So remember, x is just which state I'm thinking of. And that Shannon entropy is equal to log base 2 of 50, which is equal to 5.64 bits. And the entropy of x given y is 0, because it tells you everything you need to know. It's a sequence that spells out Minnesota, so your credence for all the different possibilities goes from equal for all 50 to it's definitely just this one. So 5.64 bits minus 0 is just 5.64 bits. So that is the information content of the sequence Minnesota. However, notice that the sequence itself is 9 characters long, where each character has 26 different possible outcomes, which has a maximum possible entropy of 9 times log base 2, 26, equal to 42.3 bits. So the information that could be stored in a sequence of length 9 with English characters is actually far, far greater than the amount of information it is storing for this particular situation. And this is a very important point to understand in the search for a minimal information replicator. The sequence length is not going to be the same in general as the information content. Not everything in the sequence, not every amino acid or letter or whatever it is necessarily going to be information about replicating. A good example of this is life on Earth today, where a lot of the genome doesn't actually contain any information because it's not constrained by purifying selection. And of course, remember that if you take the same sequence and if you put it in a different environment, the information that it has will change because we're talking about the information it has about replicating in its environment. Because remember, say it with me, information is always relative to something else. As the authors note, thus, sequence length and information content can be very different. Information is about something, while sequence length is just entropy. Therefore, the authors want to look at information content, not sequence length, as the relevant variable in the emergence of replicators. You'll notice, by the way, this is a marked departure from the way that ID advocates usually talk about the chances of replicators arising on the early Earth, where they always talk about it in terms of sequence length, not information content.
The amount of information stored in even a modest length protein defies what are called the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. The point past which the appeals to chance become implausible. If maybe there's a bike outside the building here and it's locked with a standard 4-dial lock. Yeah. If a thief comes along and wants to open it by chance, for a 4-dial lock with 10 seconds per spin, if in about 15 hours the thief could sample more than half those 10,000 combinations, in that case the chance hypothesis becomes more likely to be true than false. Okay, in the case of the specific arrangement of the amino acids in a modest length functional protein, there are not enough events from the beginning of the universe till now to have sampled more than half the possible combinations, because you've got 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 possibilities running out to 150 sites.
Right. What Dr. Meyer describes there would indeed be an incredibly naive way of trying to model the origin of life. In reality, there isn't just one specific functional protein you have to find. There are many possible functional proteins you could find, and there is not an equal likelihood of every specific combination of amino acids arising. Certain groups of combinations will arise with greater frequency than others. Information-bearing biomolecules have particular physical properties that interact with the environment in ways that non-information-bearing biomolecules don't, and that can change the probabilities of what may or may not arise on the early Earth. Of course, scientists don't know yet exactly what the probabilities are or how they would change, but that's why papers like this are being written. The authors settle on an approximate measure of the average information content of functional sequences, which is expressed as the information content of the sequence S is equal to the negative logarithm base D of n sub e over n. And here the logarithm base d just represents the number of possible monomers there are. And by monomers, they just mean like subunits of whatever biochemical sequence we're assembling by chance on the early Earth. So like amino acid bases in DNA. And n sub e is the number of functional sequences, while n is just the number of all possible sequences. In plain language, you pick some sequence length, you generate a bunch of random samples from that sequence length, you count how many of those sequences are functional, and then you take the fraction of the number of total sequences over the number of functional sequences, then take the logarithm of that fraction. That will get you the average information content of the functional sequences. This is another important point. The greater the fraction of functional sequences, like the more functional sequences you have out of all the sequences you generated, the less average information content each of those sequences has. And this makes sense if you think about it. Because if you generate like 800 functional sequences out of 1,000 total generated sequences, then each of those sequences, like if you pick any one of those sequences, it doesn't have like the unique information about how to replicate. There are many other sequences, 799 other sequences, that could also replicate. So you could change a bunch of stuff in that sequence and still replicate. So clearly, not all of the specific arrangement of whatever the subunits are in that sequence is necessarily information specifically on how to replicate. Each of them can replicate, but there are a lot of different ways to replicate, and each one of them only encapsulates one of that vast multitude of ways. So with the useful definition of information content in place, the authors actually get to running some simulations. After all, if we want to understand replication, we have to simulate an environment where sequences can actually replicate. The authors use a piece of software called Avida, which is basically a piece of software for running simulations of evolution. In Avida, sequences are actually represented using English letters, which is nice and intuitive, because really, in the software on the back end, each letter is converted into a specific CPU instruction for a virtual CPU that Avida has. So B corresponds to one particular CPU instruction, and H corresponds to another particular CPU instruction, etc. And there's a nice table in the paper that lists the corresponding CPU instruction for each letter of the alphabet. So each sequence in Avida is really a sequence of CPU instructions, and it turns out that if you get the right kind of instructions in the right order, then that sequence will replicate when it is executed in memory. There are known sequences which do replicate, such as this one that they have in the paper, but most sequences don't replicate. Remember, what we're looking for here is how the information content of replicators correlates with other important quantities like the sequence length. The authors picked several different sequence lengths, 8, 15, 30, and 100, and generated large sets of sequences for each length. For sequences of length 8, they found 6 unique replicators in 1 billion randomly generated samples. For sequences of length 15, they found 58 unique replicators in 1 billion samples. For sequences of length 30, they found 106 unique replicators in 1 billion samples. And for length 100, they found 17 unique replicators in 300 million randomly generated samples. Notice that the information content started to decrease at first, and then on the final one, length 100, it went up again. And this corresponds, of course, to the frequency of replicators increasing at first, but then on the final point of length 100 goes down. This is really interesting because it suggests that there's a minimum information content you hit at some particular length, then it starts going back up. And the authors actually suggest that this may be due to the fact that there might be certain CPU instructions, or certain maybe small sequences of instructions, that actually just universally kill any ability to replicate that you might have had. So basically, once you've got the tools in place to replicate, once you're long enough that you can fit all of the replicating stuff in there, increasing your sequence length is basically just increasing the odds that you're going to bump into one of these kill switches. True to the title, the authors also investigate changing the probability distribution for how frequent different letters will be, i.e. biasing the typewriters. So they'll raise the probability of E or F or J and lower the probability of some other letters. Because remember, if all letters are equally probable, the Shannon entropy will just be the negative sum of the probability of x times the log of the probability of x, which is equal to the negative sum of 1 over 26 times the log of 1 over 26, which is just equal to log 26, which, if we use base 26 for the logarithm, is just 1. Log base x of x is just 1. And the authors note that the distribution of letters in the English language is significantly lower than max entropy. It's about 0.89. The authors developed their bias distributions in Avida by just taking replicators, just taking the functional sequences out of all the sequences that they generated, and saying, okay, just for the functional sequences, how frequently do different letters show up? Because it turns out that among replicators, you don't just have a perfectly flat distribution of frequency between all the different possible letters. So they did this for sequences of length 8, 15, and 30. For each of them, they took a sequence of whatever, 15, like length 15, and they said, okay, generate a bunch of sequences of length 15, pick out all of the functional sequences from there, look at the frequency of letters just in the functional sequences, and now generate new sequences with that frequency distribution. The entropy of the new probability distributions for 8, 15, and 30 length sequences dropped from, of course, it started as all 1, because everything was equally likely, to 0.71, 0.91, and 0.98 for the sequences of 8, 15, and 30, respectively. And using these new probability distributions to generate sequences did indeed increase the frequency of functional sequences. For the lengths 8, 15, and 30, the frequency increased by a factor of 383, 250, and 28, respectively. And of course, the authors then tried to say, okay, how about we take these new functional sequences, make a new distribution with them, generate more samples with that, etc., in a sort of recursive inception replicator type thing, and they found that it did, redoing this over and over did increase the frequency a little bit, but there were diminishing returns. So that's pretty cool. The paper gives us interesting insights on how we can raise the likelihood of producing replicators by using probability distributions that are based only on sequences that we already know have information about replicating in their environment. As the authors mention in the discussion section, quote, "It is well known that monomers do not form spontaneously at the same rate. We also immediately note that in chemistries where molecules do not self-replicate but catalyze the formation of other molecules, the abundance distribution of monomers would change in each catalysis step. If these monomers are recycled via reversible polymerization, then the activity of the molecules can change the entropy of monomers, which in turn changes the likelihood of spontaneous discovery. Should this process run in the right direction, it is possible that self-replicators are the inevitable outcome." As we reflect on all that, I want to stress something. Look at the language in this paper, or even just in the sections I quoted. Look at how it is always talking about how it's possible that X, or that X may be the case, or that X in principle may happen. Notice the authors talk openly and frequently about the abundance of remaining problems in the field of abiogenesis. Like, quote, "In many cases, abiotic skew will work against the probability of spontaneous emergence of information, but in some cases, it may work in its favor," unquote. So this is what I want to drive home, and if you get nothing else from this video, I hope you at least remember this. Science is really, really hard. You have to be very, very careful when you do science. There are things that seem so obvious to us that Mother Nature will backhand into the stratosphere without a second thought if you try to assume them when you're doing science because, well, it just seems so obvious. Intuition doesn't work in science. So when scientists study nature, they do it very carefully and very slowly. This paper was an example of that. You probably noticed that, hey, they didn't solve the origin of life, and they used a computer simulation, not real biomolecules, and they had all of these assumptions. Yes, there were all those caveats. In science, that is not a weakness or a failure. Every generalization, every vague definition, every oversight, every unfounded assumption will be unceremoniously one-shot by the unforgiving, incomprehensible, and beautiful complexity of nature. Everything needs to be double-checked and well-defined and peer-reviewed and reproduced, and even then there will be mistakes and errors. But there will be fewer mistakes and errors than there would be if we didn't have science. So I just want to appeal to you to compare these two approaches. The approach of the intelligent design proponents who use terms like information loosely and intuitively, who make arguments with generalized analogies and appeals to common sense, who already are so sure they know how it happened, who never seem to bother trying to rigorously test or critique their own positions, with the approach of scientists, both religious and non-religious, who acknowledge our profound ignorance on questions like the origin of life, who don't try to solve everything in one step, who try to prove themselves wrong, who demand precision, who distrust their intuitions, who are all too aware of how many times we have been humbled out of our confidence that we've got it all figured out, it's obvious, just think about it. Humility and diligence are the price we pay for learning a little more about nature, and the people who really care about learning more about nature show that kind of humility and diligence.